Maria, welcome to your first Speakers for Schools virtual talk.
Thank you very much, Carly. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to our talk today and our hour together. Welcome everybody to the talk. Just to begin, I want to say what a great job Speakers for Schools is doing. I first came across your charity because I was looking for research and diversity. And I found this wonderful piece of research that actually proved when students as teenagers at GCSE levels know what they want to do, their marks and their satisfaction in school skyrocket. And I thought, wow, this is the kind of charity I want to be involved in. So today is really about you as a young student, trying to make the link between who you are and feeling the invitation into this profession. So, are you a student who follows your passion? Do you love drawing, making of any kind, making videos, music videos, dance, drama, theater, poetry? Do you think outside the box? Do you ask yourself a lot of questions? Do you like to create spaces that reflect a multicultural society? Do you think about what that means to live in a diverse society? And are you interested in creating sustainable, wonderful, breathable, equal society for everyone, for all of us, our animals, our environment, all the different people, all the different age groups? Well, then guess what? Architecture is for you. We're going to talk a little bit today about all the different roles that an architect undertakes. A lot of people think this. They think the modern architects, all of the famous people of our modern era, and all of these wonderful projects that we know about of David Adjaye, Peter Salter, Sheila O'Donnell, Zaha Hadid. There are wonderful, beautiful, famous projects in the world. But one thing that you want to think about when you want to become an architect is why. You want to ask yourself why. Why did these architects design the thing they did where they did? Why did they use those materials? Why did they use that scale? Who were they trying to impact most? What were they thinking about the environment? What was their idea for the future vision of society? These are the questions that you begin to ask yourself when you learn to think like an architect. So today we're going to go through some of the things that an architect can do. We're going to look at 6 concepts in architecture to help us see the world like an architect does and to start to feel what it's like to be an architect. And then we have 3 exciting new projects by young architects. If we don't have a lot of time for that, I will include it into the activities brief, which we will have available for upload after. And then we're going to look at the first steps to becoming an architect, very specifically related to education. And then, of course, the Q&A that I'm very much looking forward to. Please submit your questions into the chat, as Carly mentioned, as we go along, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. I thought, well, I'm a kind of a typical architect, and I wanted to show you some images of all the different things I've done. The usual things you think about. On the far right, you see the high-rise buildings, which I worked on for a number of years. On the top left, I worked on a World Bank project in St. Lucia, which was also architecture, but very much about development. I also publish. I work in human rights. I work in resettlement. So when large groups of people are being moved, we have to think about their lives, their livelihoods, what they do for a living, what relationships they have with nature, with each other, how they support each other emotionally, financially. And then I also developed games in order to interact with different groups of people in the world in order to understand what their visions are. So when you think about becoming an architect, it's not just that one famous building. Actually, our work encompasses so many areas. The boundaries of the profession of architecture are not solid lines. Let's look at some of these examples. So before we do that, I want you to think about some things about yourself. Who are you? You're a student, perhaps. Perhaps you've just graduated. You have passions. You have dreams. You speak languages. You draw. Are you involved in drama? Do you write stories? Are you involved in sports, music, games? There's going to be some kinds of books you are drawn to more. There are certain places you love to be going to, that you dream about going to, or that you have visited many times in your past. Maybe it's a historic connection with your family. Maybe it's something historic that you can't even quite explain. Who are the most important people in your life? Who are the most important relationships in your life? All of your happy times, and especially all of your difficult and challenging times, just like this era of COVID-19. These are all of the qualities that will begin shaping you as an architect. All of your humanity is what you bring to the profession of architecture. So in order to help ourselves to ask all the questions and start to think like an architect, we're going to bring in some vocabulary to help to shape that conversation that you have in your mind. We're going to look at what I'm calling 6 concepts in architecture. Of course, there will be many, many concepts, but let's look at some of the key fundamental ones. Okay, form and scale, context, place and people, function, which is about client and society, precedent, where we are learning from history and we are the great preservers of history, material, studies, place and technology, and then of course our key and ongoing client, the environment. So I'll explain what each of these mean as we look at examples. So one of my favorite examples to look at for form is Aldo Rossi's cemetery, San Cataldo Cemetery. Remember I said that architecture brings in so many fields. I like to think that Aldo Rossi was a great psychologist. He knew that when you were creating a place where people were going to be feeling fierce emotions, sadness and melancholy, he wanted to respond with form that was calm and predictable, welcoming and personal. So the way that the forms came together were in response to this very special human experience. IMP was commissioned with probably one of the most challenging projects of our century. He was asked to create a welcome center in one of the largest and most important art history areas, buildings in the world, which is the Louvre in Paris. Now, IMP, he drew from antiquity. He went back to one of our very first, and it's actually the last remaining ancient piece of relic from the ancient world, the pyramid. He drew inspiration from that, and he also knew that the triangle was very fundamental to us as a society. It was fundamental to structure, and that's what he used to create something that wouldn't take away from the Louvre. It would bring something special and new. If we look about scale, go back to scale, one of the first writers in architecture was Vitruvius, who wrote the first books of architecture in 15 BC. And these were made more famous in a way by Leonardo da Vinci, who decided to be inspired by Vitruvius and draw this, which you may have seen. It's the first time that we started to decide how the human body uses space and how we as architects can design space to respond to the very specific proportions of man. Architects use scale in lots of different ways. Think about this, a little bit outdated photo now of the Burj Khalifa. What an amazing example of power and dominion and wealth. So this is a way that architects also use the presence of scale. The University of Coimbra, this is another nice example of scale in Portugal. The University of Coimbra is one of the first universities in Europe, and it was nestled inside of a little village at the time. And the architects of the time wanted to bring the residential aspects into the design, so they used the trick of scale. So there you go. It's not exactly what you would have thought it would have been, but it's using domestic architecture to animate architecture, a larger architecture, and still feel part of a village. Let's look now at our 5th vocabulary, which is function. Now, function is an interesting one. We used to, when we think about function and we look at this almost, industrial architecture for the water towers, what we used to design for function eventually becomes art. So now this is an art presentation of all the different water towers. We have gas towers. We still have a lot of these in England. And when we design as architects, certainly we're thinking about what the function is going to be happening inside the building. But we also have a vision of what this building could be in the future. When we have the idea of sustainability in mind, we think of the reuse of the building. We think of its value later on. These are two wonderful projects that show us about function. So in Norway, we have the Arctic Seed Vault in Svalbard by Peter Sanderman. And this is a place where we are storing thousands and thousands of the seeds that we fear we will lose because of climate change. Now, the importance behind this function is that it tells us, it gives us a snapshot of where we are in society today. We are fearful of losing our different species of food, of seeds, as we have lost already some. We have lost some of animals, and we've gone to the Arctic for places to preserve. Architects have a wonderful role in supporting the preservation of our future world, of our present into our future world. Down below it, we have a wonderful project by Rintala Egertsen. And this function of this place is a composition room for a jazz artist. So when an architect designs, and although we are only seeing the outside of the building, we can see the context, we are actually looking at how an architect is representing what the client really wants to see and feel when they're doing their thing. On top, the client is the seed. It really is the seed, because the temperature, the direction, the sunlight, all the protected ways into the tunnel are for the seed. And down below, it's for the jazz artist. So they can have space to perform, they can be inspired by nature. Context. So this is a wonderful word that I've always tried to translate into every different language, because it's a very, very different word in so many different languages. Context is a kind of catch-all word that means everything, where we are, what we're feeling, what is around us, the physical things that we see, the physical things that we can't see. In the rural area, this is a kind of replica of the Renaissance era of a Tuscan villa. And we have a big sky, we have a lot of land. The materials come from local places. So context is when a building knows where it is. That's one of the most important aspects that we bring as architects. We go to a place, we recognize its climate, we recognize its elevation, we recognize its history, its population, its culture, and then we try to embed the value of that into the new structure. Here's another building that we could look at in so many different ways. We think about context. It's the Notre Dame of Paris, which we know very recently is undergoing renovation because of a fire, but it actually also had a renovation previously in 1845, and it was designed during the French Gothic era in 1260. What's important about it is that it's surrounded by water, and it's embedded in a city, it's next to a bridge, so it has these values of being deep in the heart of a society. It's very present in terms of its materials and its scale and the religiosity of the time. French Gothic architecture is mainly known for religious architecture. And when we think about context, it's very important to know where it is, what it was doing at the time, why it was built in the way it was. So as architects, we ask ourselves, why did the architects design it with this orientation? Why is the rose window, the circular window, facing the direction it is? Why is it built with this type of stone that it is? Why does it have two towers at the front? Why the flying buttresses at the back, almost like a skirt encircling the circular nave at the back? These are all the questions that the architects would have been asking themselves at the time, and what helped them to design as they did. This is an art gallery in Norway, and this art gallery is about capturing light. Light is very, very important in the Scandinavian countries. And this art gallery is actually celebrating the capture of light and created a kind of intimate experience with the trees at a ground level. So as an art gallery, what is being captured is not just the usual physical art that we know about, but actually the environment as art. And let's look at our precedent example. We think about precedent. Architects never design brand new like they arrive from Mars. Actually, an architect knows the history of architecture, knows the history of a place, the history of a culture, the history of the use of a material, the history of its technology. And when we design, oftentimes, just like IMP in the Louvre, we went back to a Greek revival style, in this case, to design the British Museum. That was Sir Robert Smirke. And what you will be most familiar with is the Great Court, the great sort of donut-shaped glass gallery by Norman Foster that he presented in 2000. It's a wonderful combination of the Greek revival style and modern architecture. Sometimes architects like to fool around with precedent. And this is an installation by Charles Moore in 1978 in New Orleans, where he played around with all different versions of historic architecture. A lot of architects really dislike this installation because they feel that it's not true to how we should be using revivalist architecture. But actually, my favorite kinds of architecture are the kinds that some people love and some people hate, because it's raised the debate in society. And that's what architecture is about, bringing everybody into the conversation, bringing in their values and their thoughts and their beliefs, and incorporating that into the everyday life experience. Think about materials that we choose: stone, brick, concrete, steel. Each of them have a warmth, an invitation. Some are austere, some are industrial, some are government, some are home. Some actually mix the two. So when we think about materials, it's very, very important that we ask ourselves what kind of ambiance and environment we want to create. Now, with the questions that are becoming more and more prominent with our environmental decay and climate change, the questions architects have always asked themselves now have a more global question as well. So if we're using materials that we have to ship all the way across the world, we think twice about that. So the environmental question comes into play. And here's a wonderful example of Charles and Ray Eames, where they reused every part of this building is from another building. So it was all reused, all of the structure, the material, the wood, the glass. And it was a way to showcase how something beautiful could come of reuse. When we think about the environment, usually we think about solar panels, we think about dams, energy, gas, wind. We think about renewable energy sources and non-renewable energy sources, and the debate about how much we want to pay for things versus how comfortable we want to be. But this question is incredibly integrated into every decision an architects make. Where is the building located? Is it facing the sun? What materials are we using? Are we producing more space than we need? All of these questions are a fundamental part of how we think about architecture. So the architect goes to a place, just like you will now begin to do, and you will see the atmosphere and the experience of a place. You will ask yourself why the architect designed the way they did. And you will ask yourself why it couldn't be different. It's such a privilege to talk to you today, to the future architects of the world. And all of these questions we look at will continue to evolve and be shaped depending on what you do. So we will use our imaginative thinking, and we will solve many questions in the world. And we will also continue to decide what is beautiful. And it's a skill that you can develop as you go along as well. So how are we doing for time? We're almost there. Okay, well, I'm just going to look at the last two slides. Okay. The first steps into becoming an architect obviously are the education. There is a foundation program that you could do, which is either full-time or it's a blended version. Part-time, part one also, which is the undergraduate level. You could do full-time or you could do a blended version, which I'll talk to you about. Part two is also a part-time. Part two is at the postgraduate level. You can do that either part-time or blended learning. What I mean by blended learning is that you are working while you're studying, and you can do that from foundation onwards. And then part three is the final requirement for ARB and RIBA to become a registered architect. On the right, we talk about preparing your portfolio, practice drawing and making of every kind every day. Set your goals as an architect, and also think about whether you want to be a full-time student or you want to study in blended practice. This is a unique program for blended practice that the RIBA runs, and you can get your part 1, part 2 while you're working. You can also do your foundation while you're working. And I'm going to give you activities and information about this in the upload, so you can think about that more deeply on your own. Just as a final slide, I'm going to tell you that one of the most important things about being in a creative industry is how much satisfaction it brings you to as a human being. It brings so much deep self-realization. And architecture is one of the key creative industries, although there are many. And it is particularly can be costly and challenging to study, but there are affordable routes, just like the blended learning we talked about, the RIBA Studio, for example. All of the routes require deep, deep, great passion and commitment. So thank you. And that was just a little introduction to architecture. So I think we can take your questions now, if that's okay.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Maria. So we have a few questions here from our students. We've had a lot submitted in the past couple of minutes, which is fantastic. So to get things started and just thinking about your own role and your own motivations for your job, Daniel asks, what made you want to undertake architecture and what made you want to do this job? And Nashan asks if there was anything that particularly inspired you. Oh, those are wonderful questions. Thank you. You know, I think it's such a privilege for me to talk to you because you're young teenagers. I think when I was a young teenager, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wish someone had something like charity speakers for schools, because I would have loved to have learned more about the profession. For me, I went into the profession because I really had a passion for helping to make people's lives better. And you know, I grew up in, my parents are immigrants, so I knew what it was like to go to a new place and not quite fit in. And when I would go back to our home country and when I was with my grandparents, I somehow knew that we fit in better there, but why couldn't we translate that? So that was a really interesting thing for me to think about from very early on. Some of the things that inspired me really were more about how people who actually were not architects built. So how farmers built places, how in ancient times houses were built against cliffs. What really interested me was how people actually were buried. Every different culture buried people in different ways. I was so moved by these things. And although at the time I didn't think that it meant architecture, eventually these things added together to say to me, wow, all of these things mean that I could be an architect. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions here, which is absolutely fantastic. Jake asks, do you have any advice for people wanting to do your job? Sure. I think what would be a really good way to start. So I guess the question would be like to develop your aspiration and ask yourself these questions when you go to a place. And really, you know, you could go into your kitchen and ask yourself these questions. You could go for a walk into a park and you can ask yourself all these questions about why it was designed in certain ways and why do birds thrive in a certain area? Why is there noise in one area? Why is there no pollution in one area? Ask yourself these kinds of questions. And these are the kinds of aspirational questions that get you involved and start to ignite your reason for wanting to become an architect. In terms of education, I think there are basically two routes. One is where you are full-time in school and you know, it has a certain cost associated with that. And then the other route is where you are in practice right away and you are doing your studies part-time. And it's not to say that you couldn't actually do one for a while and then at another level do another. But it's important to think about, what kind of a learner are you? Are you someone who learns better by doing? Or are you someone who needs to be guided day to day on educational approach? I think that's a really good question. When people come to terms with what kind of a learner they are, then they start to make the more appropriate choices for themselves. Because there are many ways to become an architect. It's about finding the route that suits you as a learner. So in the activities download, I will include a lot of those things so that you can do more research about that.
That's fantastic, thank you. We have a question and comment from James here, who says, "Hi, Dr. Faraone, thank you for the talk. It was extremely helpful and insightful. I really enjoy art and wanted to know how creative you can be in the field and university. Is there a lot of room for artistic expression?"
Oh, that's such a good question. Interestingly, there's a really big difference, and there's a lot of debate out there as well. So in academia, we do what we call the academic project. And then in the world, we do the practice-based architecture. So let's start with the practice-based one, the one that people do in practice. You know, there's a timeline, there's a budget, there's a cost constraint. The client absolutely wants it made out of concrete, no matter what. You know, we have these very specific constraints. In academia, you get to play and explore and examine. You get to research areas that are really interesting for you. And so those constraints are not there. And the exploration and imaginative inquiry really is sometimes even daunting, how much freedom you have. But when you have really good tutors, as you would have, you know, in any of the programs you go into, they will help to guide you so that you gain. The most important quality is confidence. You gain the confidence to make those choices, to follow up on your imagination. That's what it's about. Now, remember, I started this by saying there's a debate. So there is a debate, because if in school you're doing all wonderful imaginative things, and then in practice you're doing, you know, really constrained things, that means that when you go from education to practice, there's a lot you have to learn while you're in practice. But we know that there's a continuum that happens across that. So it's important to have that place to play and to explore and to play with your imagination. And actually, you can start today. You know, you can come up with a brief, a client, a location, and use those vocabularies that we came up today to start to refine what you're doing and ask yourself why, and have a response for each of the whys.
That's wonderful advice. Thank you so much. Grace asks, how much of the job requires knowledge of maths and physics? How much of it requires artistic prowess? And how much of it requires other factors like cultural recognition?
Oh, very good. Okay, so I'm going to start backwards, because I think cultural recognition is fundamental, absolutely fundamental. Knowledge of people and place are key. Those are the most important things. Then the second question was about the arts. And as I mentioned, there are so many different ways to show your artistic capacity. So in the downloads, I've included a link to a portfolio guide. And the portfolio guide will tell you, you can include videos, theater, play, wonderful cuisine, of course, drawing, whether it's sketching, charcoal, whether it's watercolor, you know, all different forms of media, of making models. So in architecture school, you really learn as you go along. You learn, you see images and you think, wow, how did they do that? And you start to discover, just like the image you see here. I purposely put this here because this went back and forth. This wasn't produced all at once, but it went back and forth with the smudging and the charcoal and the pen and ink. And so there's layers of buildup to artistic endeavor. So really the artistry is important, not because you're showing us you're an artistic person, it's because you're communicating your idea. So what we help you to do is to learn to communicate your idea. And the different forms of making are about that. The first part of your question was about math and physics. We don't require that. We don't, at Oxford Brookes, for example, we don't require that. I think that used to be like that, and there still may be. some universities, which you can look up to find out, they may require math and physics, but it's not required. From first year and second year, you study structures, but you study structures that's required for an architect to be able to liaise with engineers as you go along. But the key is, as you ask your questions, culture, cultural context, people, place, and especially learning how to represent your ideas. So I think that's something you can practice now. And in the portfolio guide that I'm linking you to in the uploads, you can start to see what those might be, and you can practice them. There's so many YouTube videos, there's so many books to help you to develop new ways of communication. And I think that's the way to think about it, not to ask yourself, oh, am I artistic enough? It's not about that. It's about communication. And if you can learn many different forms of communication, then that's what it's about.
That's fantastic advice. And Cara has asked, what are the best subjects to study at A-level, or what would you recommend for a future career in architecture?
Oh, that's really good. Well, I think geography is very, very important. Could be, but I mean, it's not a prerequisite. But if we think about, let's go to the end. So in school, we studied 4 key topics. Okay, so all the different subjects fall into these areas. One is, of course, the studio, the design project. Then we study cultural context. We study technology, and then we study the practice, the practical aspects of architecture. So if we think about human geography informing about people and place, if you're interested in biology, that could inform how you do things. If you're interested in technology, that can inform things. If you're interested in history and English literature, that is a really, really good subject because it helps you to do your research about people and place. And there is also writing in the architecture degrees where you're writing papers, research papers and dissertations. You can study philosophy. Philosophy is a wonderful way to help you open up your thinking, studying how various people think in the world and bringing that thinking into your design work. Of course, art will help you. It give you a kind of a boost in developing your portfolio, which you would keep developing and editing for when you apply for architecture schools. So I think it's playing on your strengths, the things you really, really love to do, and also not closing any doors, keeping things open. So it's a range across the humanities and the sciences, really.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Diana says, hi, Dr. Faraone. Your talk was very useful. I just wanted to ask you, I'm currently struggling on what part of architecture interests me and struggling to decide if I want to do interior architecture or architecture. Do you have any advice?
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Well, I think, both interior architecture and landscape architecture, they're all wonderful fields of creativity. And I think if you're asking yourself, oh, which area to focus on, but I think maybe the answer's already inside you, because if you think about, what you love to do, what you think about, what kind of films you love to watch, what kind of books you like to read, what's inside of that. When you think about the friendships that you have closest to you in your life, what do you talk about? You'll see that inside of there's going to be a theme, and it may not be what you think is directly linked to architecture, but believe me, it does. If you are often talking about animals or history or cooking projects or a very specific place in your life that you've been to that you adored, these are all things that inside of them hold the seeds for what can lead you to architecture. And at the same time, you don't have to really know what your main focus is. It'll help a lot at the beginning, but what I can guarantee you is whatever your focus is now, it will evolve. It could deepen, it will broaden, but it will certainly change over time. So don't worry too much about that. If you're drawn to the field of architecture or interiors, and you're not sure why, I think that one of the nicest thing to do is to look at, there's a few magazines online where they showcase the person and the project. Dezeen is one of them, D-E-Z-E-E-N. I will include that in the downloads as well. So there are 3 or 4 places online where you could look at projects, look at interiors, look at architecture projects, and you can start to see why people are doing what they're doing and what their focus is. And that will help you a lot to help to kind of decipher what it is you're after.
That's wonderful advice, thank you. And Sam asks, what would you advise our students add to their portfolios to help make it stand out?
Okay, well, so I'm glad I'm including the portfolio guidance, so that would be very helpful. One of the things that I find really interesting when I see a new portfolio from an applicant is that they have a line of reasoning, like a theme that travels all across the portfolio, and that they've thought about how to edit it. So the whole thing kind of works together as a whole, and there's a real question that's being presented through the whole piece. And some of the pieces are answering it more directly and some not as directly, a little bit indirectly. But that when you've closed that portfolio, you think, oh, I know, this student is asking this important question. And that's about editing. And it's not hard to make different pieces that you think are disassociated become associated. It depends how you put it all together. So I think that's something you can think about as you're putting it together. So it's not just a few pieces thrown together, but think about how to edit it and how to make it a cohesive line of reasoning.
That's great, thank you. Cameron is interested in what an architect's day-to-day life would look like in a professional practice.
Okay, well, thank you for that question, and it's a challenging one to answer because architects do many different things. So I can give you, let's say I give you 4 very brief examples on an architect the architects that I presented before, the Zaha Hadid version of the architect. You wake up very early, sometimes 4 or 5 in the morning. You're so excited, your client wants this project, and the stone from Florence isn't arriving yet. So, you ask all these questions. At the office, you work very closely with your colleagues. It's a very much a collaborative work. The high-rise project I worked on Canary Wharf, at the beginning, early conceptual stage, there were 4 or 5 architects. At the heart of it, when we were developing the design, then construction drawings, there were sometimes 20, 25 architects. And then at the end, as the site architect, there were 2 or 3, up to 5. But really, it grows and shrinks. So it's a team effort. You're always working with other people. And every architect has their specialty for that particular project. Maybe it's the curtain wall, maybe it's the foundation, maybe it's working with the infrastructure, maybe it's the special interiors, and they're working with the interior fit out group. So that's what that could look like. On the other hand, there are architects who are, we call them critical architects and historians, who do a lot of writing. They write about pieces, they write books. And so, wow, that their everyday to life could be anything. They could be anywhere, writing anywhere. A lot of people who do that also teach. And usually, I think a more typical thing for an architect is to have a portfolio of work. And what I mean by a portfolio of work is doing many different things. A little bit of writing, a little bit of international work, a little bit of local work. And then it grows and changes depending on the times and what's needed out there. So I think you get to make your own life. If you go the traditional where you work in a practice, which is very good to do, especially if you're in a practice that are doing the things you love, you learn a lot. But then you get the freedom to maybe have your own practice. On the continent in Europe, 90% of the architecture practices are single practitioner architects. So only one person in the practice is actually a registered architect. It's very different in the UK, where we have far more multi-architect partnerships. But who knows? Maybe that begins to change. We see we see what you guys are going to do next.
That's wonderful. Emily asks, what's the hardest part of your job?
Oh, wow. I think I think the hardest part of my job is it's probably the most exciting part as well. It's when I have a client and I can see the long-term impact of the work, but with the client, they see the initial thing, like how much longer it will take or how much more it will cost. And it's trying to help them to get that vision, really to convince them of the longer term agenda. And most of the time, you have to compromise. Most of the time, you won't get your vision, but you've shifted the client a little bit. And I think that's the most challenging, but also I think that's one of our key roles as architects, is to be able to do that.
That's wonderful. And a very popular question here from Harry is, I'm set on being an architect. I have chosen my GCSEs to fit in with an architectural route. However, if in the future I realise this isn't for me, do you know of any jobs that I could go into where I can use the skills I've already developed?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And thank you for asking that, Harry, because I'm just doing some research into widening participation. And, you know, one of the things that I would say I don't like about higher education is that when people leave a course or don't follow through on that degree, it's almost like they failed. I don't think that at all. When you're in a program like architecture, you learn a really, really critical thing, which we call critical constructive reasoning. You learn how to uncover a problem and how to bring forward really wonderful imaginative ideas to solve them. That sounds like any career to me. 70% of the people who are in architecture school go on to part 2. But of the final ones who ring the bell at the end to registration, there's not that many, but let's say it's something like 60% of the ones who start. But those people who shift and change, they become very powerful people in other industries. So, for example, if you are a critical thinker, you can get into so many different areas in the built environment. I mean, you know, there's all kinds of areas within, you know, planning, urban design, real estate, construction, all those within the built environment. And then outside the built environment, there's so many areas of strategic thinking and business in general that look for creative entrepreneurial minds. And I think that's the beauty of studying architecture, is that it gives you that place, that confidence and those skills to be a critical and constructive thinker. And I think that when people leave the field and having done their best and enjoyed architecture, they are actually armed to do so many other things. And I think would be amiss to even list them, but in the business world, in the humanities, and, you know, some people go on to go into medical science. There's so many different places where creativity is desired, and where you get to play and grow that confidence in the field of architecture is like a seed for all of that.
That's fantastic. I think we have time for one more question. And this is from Gracie in Bedford, who is 12. And Gracie asks, what is your favourite building and why?
Oh, wow, Gracie. Wow, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. You know, I think my favorite building, oh, that's a really hard one. I guess there would be a personal favorite building, and then I would say a public favorite building. So my public favorite building is the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And there's so many reasons why I love that building. One of the reasons is because as we've shifted power in society, different people occupied the building for different reasons. It went from, you know, from Christian to Islam to a public building, back to Islam. And the way the building was actually designed, it was the very first building in the world where we learned to put a round cupola roof on a square base. And it was 2 mathematicians that came up with that structure. So for me, that building represents so much about who we are as a society, changing, how we adapt, our imagination. On a personal level, I will have to tell you my grandmother's house on a farm in a remote area in central Italy is always going to be the closest place to my heart. I remember how it smells, the smell of the stairs, the big heavy walls, the creaky wooden doors. For me, that is as close to architecture as we will ever get. It's personal, it's full of love, it's full of history, and it's full of culture. So those are my two buildings. Thank you, Gracie. I hope you can think about what your two buildings are.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today, Maria. It really is appreciated. We had over 200 questions submitted from our audience, so our sincere apologies that we weren't able to get to them all today. And that is all we have time for, I'm afraid.